The St. Lawrence River had always been a symbol of distance from the great wars of Europe. It wound past quiet fishing villages, small ports, and towns where people believed the Atlantic storms and the world's conflicts stayed far beyond the horizon. Yet in the summer of 1942, the water carried a different kind of current. Rumors began filtering upriver from the Gulf. Fishermen swore they had seen periscopes. Coastal radio operators reported strange signals. At first, many Canadians dismissed it as nerves brought on by the grim headlines overseas, but officers in Ottawa were already studying intercepted German transmissions. They suspected that Admiral Karl Dönitz had turned his attention to North America's inland waterways. The Battle of the Atlantic was raging, and the Allies depended heavily on convoys leaving Montreal and Quebec City. The St. Lawrence was a lifeline. It was also a vulnerability. In the early morning fog of May 1942, the merchant ship SS Nicoya steamed northeast along the lower river, carrying supplies bound for the Caribbean. The crew had relaxed somewhat as they traveled farther from the open ocean, unaware that U-553 had slipped undetected through the Cabot Strait days earlier. Kapitän Leutnant Karl Thurman watched the freighter through his periscope and recorded in his log that the ship behaved as if it were in safe waters. The torpedo he fired struck Nicoya amidships, blasting a plume of water and steel into the air. Crewmen were thrown from their bunks or hurled across the deck. Minutes later, a second torpedo struck the SS Leto, another merchant ship traveling on the same route. Smoke stained the gray sky, and the river smelled of burning fuel. These attacks confirmed the fears of Canadian naval intelligence. The enemy had found a way in. Word traveled quickly upriver. Newspapers printed headlines that startled civilians who had assumed the war was an ocean away. The idea that German submarines could slip past Canadian defenses and strike within sight of their shores unsettled even seasoned mariners. In Quebec City, longshoremen gathered in taverns discussing whether more ships would be lost. Captain André Bouchard of the Royal Canadian Naval Reserve recalled that the atmosphere felt charged with disbelief. He later wrote that the St. Lawrence had shifted from a channel of commerce to a hidden battlefield almost overnight. The Royal Canadian Navy had already been stretched thin, escorting convoys across the Atlantic. Many of its ships were small corvettes built hurriedly at the start of the war. Their crews were young and often inexperienced. Yet the government understood that the St. Lawrence could not fall to enemy control. Merchant shipping from the Great Lakes traveled down the river toward overseas convoys carrying food, raw materials, and munitions. Montreal and Quebec City were vital industrial centers. If the Germans managed to disrupt the river's traffic, the Allied war effort would suffer. New escorts were assigned, air patrols increased, and listening posts along the banks were expanded. Civilian sailors also found themselves drawn into the conflict. Pilot boats and fishing vessels reported suspicious wakes or drifting debris. Some locals claimed to have seen dark shapes beneath the surface on moonlit nights. In the town of Rimouski, a young telegraph operator named Henri Dupuis took pride in tracking radio static that might indicate U-boat transmissions. Military officers sometimes dismissed civilian reports, but they could not deny the growing list of sunk or damaged vessels. The river was no longer peaceful water. It was a corridor where danger moved silently. By the height of summer, German operations intensified. U-boats lurked near Baie Comeau, Trois Pistoles, and Anticosti Island. Navigating the St. Lawrence posed challenges for them, from shifting sandbars to swift currents, yet the captains believed the risk worthwhile. The inland route offered targets that might otherwise be protected in the Atlantic. Many of the merchant ships sailing these waters traveled alone, trusting the illusion of safety. On several occasions, U-boats attacked in broad daylight. Survivors later described seeing the distinctive silhouette of a conning tower breach the surface before a torpedo struck. In late June, the Canadian corvette HMCS Weyburn was dispatched to investigate a report of a submarine sighted near the Gaspé Peninsula. The crew scanned the water, searching for the telltale glint of a periscope. At dusk, they spotted an oil slick, evidence that a U-boat had been present. The captain ordered depth charges dropped, shaking the riverbed with underwater detonations. Fishermen on the shore heard the blasts rolling through the valley. Although the attack damaged no submarine, it signaled that the Canadian Navy was beginning to push back. The psychological impact of the campaign was profound. In Quebec, merchants worried about insurance costs for shipping goods. The federal government debated whether to close the river to transatlantic shipping. Some argued that doing so would bottleneck crucial supplies at inland ports. Others insisted that preventing further losses outweighed the economic disruption. Families along the river lit fewer lamps at night, afraid they might silhouette passing ships. A sense of vulnerability settled on the region. People had grown up believing that invaders could never reach so far inland. Now the war felt close enough to smell on the wind. One evening that July, a convoy of merchant vessels left Quebec City escorted by 2 corvettes. A young lookout named William Foster stood on the bow of HMCS Drummondville, listening to the rhythmic thump of the engines. He later remembered the blend of tension and pride that filled the crew. They were defending home waters. As the convoy approached the open Gulf, the Drummondville's sonar operator detected faint echoes that suggested a submarine shadowing them. Moments later, a torpedo streaked past the bow of one of the freighters, missing by only a few yards. The escort vessels surged forward, dropping depth charges, while the merchant ships zigzagged to evade attack. Though the U-boat escaped, the incident proved that the enemy was growing bolder and more skillful at navigating the river. Canadian authorities responded by increasing aerial surveillance. RCAF Hudson bombers patrolled the Gulf, scanning the water for periscopes or oil trails. Their presence forced some U-boats to operate more cautiously, diving frequently and attacking only at night. Yet the Germans remained determined. Admiral Dönitz considered operations in the St. Lawrence a strategic experiment that could disrupt Allied logistics. Several U-boats were ordered to the region under strict instructions to strike swiftly and vanish before escorts could respond. By early autumn, the river's reputation had changed dramatically among sailors. What had once been a familiar and predictable route now bristled with unseen threats. Merchant captains spoke of traveling with their hands tight on the wheel, listening for the thud of a torpedo. Navy officers briefed crews on new tactics for river defense. Meanwhile, the public followed each newspaper report with anxious interest. Every sinking felt like an intrusion into the heart of Canada. As the leaves began to turn along the riverbanks, the Canadian government made a difficult decision. In September 1942, the St. Lawrence River was officially closed to all overseas shipping. Only small coastal routes and internal traffic were permitted. It was a decision rooted in necessity. Too many ships had been lost and too many sailors killed. Yet closing the river also conceded that the Germans had achieved something remarkable. They had pushed the front line of the war deep into North America's interior. The inhabitants of the St. Lawrence Valley adjusted to a new reality. Children playing near the shore watched warships pass where cargo vessels once sailed. Searchlights swept the night sky. Radios crackled with coded messages. The war overseas had merged with daily life at home. The quiet river had become a contested battleground. As autumn storms gathered and the days shortened, the sense of unease deepened. The U-boats were still out there, hidden beneath the dark surface, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And though winter would soon bring ice to the river, the conflict that had begun that summer was far from over. The Canadians prepared for the next phase, knowing that the enemy would not easily be driven out. The forgotten battle had only just begun. Autumn settled over the Gulf of St. Lawrence with a cold that crept into the bones of every sailor. The mornings arrived wrapped in thick fog that clung to the water like wool and muted the sound of ship engines until they seemed to hum from nowhere. It was in this shifting gray world that the Canadian Navy and the German U-boats fought their most perilous encounters. Visibility often shrank to mere meters, turning every patrol into a contest of nerves. The river, once a pathway for trade, had become a maze where hunters and hunted drifted through silence. Among those navigating this uncertain battlefield was HMCS Clayoquot, a Bangor-class minesweeper assigned to escort duty along the lower river. Lieutenant James Crawford, its captain, understood the dangers of the fog better than most. He had spent years at sea, yet the St. Lawrence unsettled him. The river's currents pulled in strange directions, and coastal silhouettes faded without warning. On many patrols, the crew relied entirely on sonar and instinct. Crawford drilled his men relentlessly, reminding them that a U-boat needed only a single clear shot to send a ship to the bottom. In late October 1942, a report came from a coastal lookout near Rimouski, claiming that a dark shape had been seen slipping beneath the surface at dawn. The message reached Crawford while his ship was refueling in Gaspé. He ordered immediate departure, and the Clayoquot steamed west into the dense fog that blanketed the river. The crew stood at stations long before the sun had risen. Every man knew that U-boat captains favored low visibility. The Germans relied on stealth, and the St. Lawrence offered ample hiding places along its broad channel. Meanwhile, offshore, U-boat U-517 under Capitaine Lieutenant Paul Hartwig moved carefully along the deep trough near Anticosti Island. Hartwig had already struck several merchant vessels in the region that autumn and had built a reputation among German command for boldness. He studied Canadian patrol patterns closely and believed that the fog weakened their defensive grid. In his log, he wrote that the river felt like a narrow corridor filled with shadows, ideal for ambushes. His crew shared his confidence. They had slipped through Canadian waters undetected for days, watching convoys pass like ghosts. On the evening of October 14th, U-517 spotted a small convoy escorted by HMCS Arrowhead and HMCS Georgian. Hartwig maneuvered his submarine into firing position, relying on careful calculations rather than direct sight. The fog was so thick that even from the periscope, the surface resembled a pale wall. Trusting his hydrophone operator, he fired 2 torpedoes. Moments later, explosions tore through the water as the SS Carolus shuddered under the impact. The merchant ship began to list, sending sailors scrambling to launch lifeboats that immediately disappeared into the haze. The escorts raced toward the attack, dropping depth charges in booming sequences that sent tremors through the riverbed. Yet Hartwig evaded them, slipping deeper into the trough and gliding away unseen. News of the sinking spread fast among ships upriver. Many crewmen had grown accustomed to danger, but felt a renewed dread in the fog. Some believed the Germans could hear every whispered conversation aboard their vessels. Others feared that the river itself betrayed them, amplifying their engine noise through narrow channels. One sailor on HMCS Georgian later recalled that the fog felt alive, as if it listened and waited. He described standing watch with his heart pounding as he strained to detect the faintest ripple on the water. The Canadian Navy responded by tightening its patrol network. New listening posts were activated along the Gaspé Peninsula, and aircraft were ordered to fly low over the river whenever weather allowed. Yet the fog often grounded flights, leaving the ships to fend for themselves. Lieutenant Crawford and the crew of the Clayoquot pushed onward through it, following reports of U-boat sightings. Late one night, sonar detected a faint contact northwest of Anticosti Island. Crawford ordered the engines to low speed. The crew fell silent as the Clayoquot drifted like a shadow through the mist. The sonar operator's voice rose over the intercom. "Bearing steady. Possible submarine." Crawford gripped the rail, listening to the rhythmic pulses that echoed through the hull. He ordered depth charges prepared. When the contact grew stronger, he gave the command to fire. Explosions rolled through the fog, sending geysers of water skyward. For a moment the crew waited, breath held, listening for the sound of breaking metal or a rising oil slick. Nothing surfaced. If a submarine had been there, it had escaped. Crawford stared into the gray, aware that the river had hidden the truth once again. Farther east, U-69, under Kapitän Leutnant Ulrich Graf, was conducting its own patrol. Graf was younger than many U-boat commanders, but he had earned praise for navigating difficult waters. He understood that the St. Lawrence was not the open Atlantic. The tides were stronger than many charts indicated, and sandbars shifted with each storm. He approached his patrol with caution. One night, while cruising near Grande Vallée, he heard the distant rumble of Canadian corvettes. The sound moved unpredictably, distorting through the fog. Graf decided against attacking and instead dived to the riverbed, resting his submarine on soft silt until the danger passed. Although the German campaign had caused significant losses, the Canadian forces slowly adapted. Crews became more skilled at interpreting sonar echoes. Pilots learned to identify subtle disturbances caused by submarines at periscope depth. Cooperation between naval and air patrols improved. Still, the fog remained their most persistent enemy. In some engagements, escorts fired blindly, hoping to strike anything lurking below. The psychological weight of the hunt wore heavily on everyone involved. In Quebec City, families prayed for sailors whose ships sailed past Lévis into the gray curtain covering the lower river. In Newfoundland Harbor, workers paused whenever depth-charge blasts rumbled in the distance. Even German sailors felt the tension. Hartwig later confessed in his wartime diary that operating in the St. Lawrence was far more unnerving than patrolling the mid-Atlantic. He wrote that the narrowness of the channel created a sense of being trapped, hunted from above and below. Despite these challenges, the U-boats remained active. On October 19th, U-517 struck again, torpedoing the SS Rose Castle in the Gulf while narrowly avoiding an aerial attack by an RCAF Hudson bomber. Flames shot across the water, painting the fog orange. Rescue boats struggled to find survivors as waves and thick smoke obscured their search. The sinking added pressure on Canadian commanders who warned Ottawa that morale among sailors was strained. The government began shifting additional escorts from Atlantic duty, determined to restore control of the river. Lieutenant Crawford knew that by winter's approach, the ice would deter most submarine activity. Yet late autumn was still dangerous. One November night, the Clayoquot encountered a drifting lifeboat from a recently torpedoed freighter. Survivors were half frozen, their hands raw from paddling blindly through the fog. They told Crawford that the attack had come without warning. A torpedo struck, the lights failed, and everything vanished in steam and smoke. Crawford listened quietly, realizing again how thin the line was between vigilance and catastrophe. The fog continued to dictate the rhythm of the battle. Some days it swallowed ships entirely, leaving them suspended in a colorless void. Other nights it thinned just enough to reveal outlines of distant headlands, only to close again moments later. The crews of both sides grew accustomed to operating in a world without horizon or sky, where sound traveled farther than sight and survival depended on instinct. As winter approached, the fog began to lift more often, revealing the battered river beneath clear, frigid skies. The season would soon force the U-boats to withdraw, but the lessons learned in the fog remained etched into every sailor's memory. The Canadians had become more coordinated, more confident, and more determined. The Germans understood that the river was no longer the easy hunting ground it had been in early summer. The battle had shifted and hardened. The St. Lawrence, once veiled in calm mist, had become a proving ground where courage and caution shaped every encounter. As the first ice formed along the shorelines, both hunter and hunted prepared for the next phase of the campaign, knowing that the struggle for control of the river was far from finished. When the first ice formed along the banks of the St. Lawrence in late 1942, many believed the season would bring a lull in the fighting. Winter had a way of forcing ships to safer harbors and driving submarines back toward the open Atlantic. Yet the river, hardened by cold and carved by tides, became an ally to those determined to defend it. The Canadians had learned the rhythms of the water, and the river itself seemed to push back against the invaders who had used its depths to strike so boldly. What had begun as a corridor of fear slowly shifted into a theater of resilience. As spring returned in 1943, German U-boats attempted to re-enter the Gulf. Admiral Dönitz had not abandoned his interest in the St. Lawrence despite the setbacks of late 1942. The German Naval Command recognized that inland shipping routes remained valuable targets and believed that renewed pressure could force Canada to divert even more resources away from the Atlantic. But the Canadians had spent the winter reorganizing. New corvettes were added to escort groups. Air patrols were expanded from Gaspé, Montjoly, and Sydney. Training intensified, and crews now understood the river's complexities far better than they had the previous summer. One of the first U-boats to test the strengthened defenses was U-190, commanded by Oberleutnant Hans-Ernst Schroeder. He approached the Gulf cautiously, mindful that Canadian aircraft had become far more aggressive. Even before reaching the Cabot Strait, his hydrophone operator detected the drone of RCAF patrol bombers. Schroeder ordered deeper dives than usual to avoid detection, but he understood that operating in the St. Lawrence was no longer the daring advantage it had once been. The water that had sheltered U-boats a year earlier now held more eyes and ears than ever. The Canadians had also improved their intelligence gathering. Radio interception units along the Atlantic coast monitored encrypted German transmissions. While they could not decode everything, patterns revealed approximate U-boat movements. Combined with reports from fishermen, lighthouse keepers, and coastal observers, these signals allowed commanders to predict possible entry points into the river. The result was a defensive net more coordinated than at any point in the campaign. In early May 1943, the SS Derry-Coonihi, a British merchant ship en route to Montreal, joined a small convoy escorted by HMCS Summerside and HMCS Trentonian. The sailors aboard these vessels sensed the change in the river. Months earlier, they had sailed in fear of unseen torpedoes. Now they felt a cautious confidence. The escorts maintained tight formations. Sonar operators were more disciplined, and aircraft overhead flew predictable patterns designed to pressure any lurking U-boat into making mistakes. Still, the river remained dangerous. Fog crept in without warning. Tides shifted abruptly, and the silence of the water often played tricks on even the most seasoned crews. On the night of May 7th, the convoy passed near the entrance to the river when the sonar operator aboard Summerside detected a faint echo that did not match the usual terrain of the channel. Lieutenant Commander A.W. Debenham, the ship's captain, ordered a sharp turn and signaled Trentonian. The two corvettes began a coordinated search pattern, weaving across the convoy's course with practiced precision. Within minutes, the contact grew clearer. A submarine was attempting to slip beneath the convoy at periscope depth. Debenham gave the order to attack. Depth charges thundered through the water in tightly spaced intervals. Each detonation sent geysers rising through the night. The crews listened for telltale signs of damage. When a thick stream of oil surfaced, both ships tightened their search. For nearly an hour they pounded the suspected position, forcing the U-boat deeper and deeper. Finally the echoes faded. Whether the submarine had been destroyed or escaped, damaged into deeper waters remained uncertain, but the convoy passed unmolested. The next morning, Canadian pilots spotted an oil slick stretching across the current, thick enough to suggest a crippled submarine. The men aboard Summerside took it as proof that their training and coordination had paid off. Farther upriver, life along the St. Lawrence had changed as well. Villagers in places like Matane, Saint-Anne-des-Monts, and Les Escoumins had spent the previous year watching ships burn offshore. Now they witnessed corvettes sailing with a sense of purpose rather than desperation. Children waved at aircraft patrolling overhead. Local fishermen reported fewer sightings of suspicious wakes or oil streaks. Many believed the worst of the danger had passed, though commanders in Ottawa remained cautious. The Germans still sought opportunities, and a single torpedo could undo months of progress. In late summer, U-boat activity briefly surged. U-536, under Kapitän Lieutenant Rolf Schauenberg, attempted to enter the Gulf to coordinate with a planned rescue operation for captured German agents. By this point, Canadian forces were attuned to unusual activity in the region. Aircraft from RCAF Station Montjoly spotted the submarine's snorkel protruding through calm water. When they swooped in for an attack, Schauenberg crashed, dived, and disappeared beneath the surface. For 3 days, Canadian ships and aircraft hunted U-536 across the Gulf. The chase became one of the most intense pursuits of the entire campaign. Despite their efforts, the U-boat slipped away into the Atlantic, damaged but not destroyed. The near trapping of U-536 illustrated how dramatically the balance had shifted. In 1942, the U-boats had been predators. By 1943, they were often prey. Canadian corvettes had grown more confident in their equipment. Air crews learned to coordinate radar sweeps with sonar readings from ships. Listening posts accurately relayed movements. The river seemed to assist the defenders, as if its tides and currents favored those who knew it best. As the summer waned, the German command grew frustrated. Dönitz recognized that the St. Lawrence campaign no longer offered the strategic rewards it had once promised. Losses increased, the element of surprise vanished, and the increasingly fortified river made navigation hazardous. In September 1943, he quietly ordered U-boats to cease operations in the inland waters of Canada. The closure was not ceremonious. There was no final battle or last stand. Instead, the U-boats simply stopped coming. The St. Lawrence, once a vulnerable artery, had become too costly to attack. Yet the effects of the battle lingered. More than 24 merchant ships and several Canadian naval vessels had been lost since 1942. Hundreds of sailors had died. Entire communities along the river had spent months listening for explosions in the distance or scanning the water for survivors. The campaign left emotional scars that lasted long after the final U-boat withdrew. Many Canadians, particularly those living along the Gulf, came to see the river not just as a geographic feature, but as a symbol of endurance. It had carried the nation's lifeblood through a war that threatened to reach its heart. As winter approached once more, the river grew quiet. Ice floes drifted past lighthouses that had watched the battles play out. Corvettes returned to Halifax or Quebec City for refits. Air squadrons shifted their focus back to the Atlantic. The sense of urgency that had defined 1942 faded into memory. Yet sailors who had served in the campaign carried with them the knowledge that the St. Lawrence had tested them as harshly as any ocean. By early 1944, any remaining doubts about the end of the campaign were gone. German strategy had shifted, and the river no longer lay in the path of their ambitions. For the Canadians who had fought there, the victory was a quiet one. It was not marked by parades or speeches. Instead, it lived in the stories told in kitchen tables along the valley and in the logs of ships that had patrolled through fog, ice, and fear. The river that fought back had done so not with guns or engines, but with the courage of the men who defended it and the resolve of the communities that stood behind them. And long after the war ended, the St. Lawrence remained a reminder that even the most peaceful waters can become battlegrounds when history demands it.